The dead don't just haunt places. Sometimes they find a way to update their records. My name is Thomas Hayes, and I'm a medical archivist at St. Michael's Hospital. For 22 years, my world has been a quiet, ordered universe of paper, ink, and dust. I work in the sub-basement, in an archive that predates most of the hospital's modern wings. It's a labyrinth of steel shelves holding millions of patient records, each one a sealed story of life, sickness, and sometimes death. I love the silence down here. The low hum of the climate control unit and the scent of aging paper are the only companions I've ever needed. Up above, the hospital is a place of chaos and noise, of desperate hope and gut-wrenching grief. But down here, everything is still. Everything is filed. Everything has a place. My job is to maintain that order. I handle requests from doctors needing historical patient data, process new records for long-term storage, and oversee the slow, methodical work of digitizing decades of paper trails. It's an anachronistic role in a digital age. But the hospital's board has always been firm about maintaining a physical archive for legal and historical purposes. They call it our institutional memory. I call it my kingdom. The first strange thing happened 6 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday, a slow afternoon, and I was retrieving a file on a patient named David Chen, who had a complex case of osteosarcoma in the late 1980s. Dr. Evans, one of the hospital's top oncologists, needed to review the case notes for an upcoming conference. I located the file, pulled it from the shelf, and brought it back to my desk. The file was exactly as it should have been, a thick manila folder with a faded label, filled with progress notes, lab reports, and treatment summaries. Everything looked perfectly normal until I began to scan the contents for a specific chemotherapy protocol. A single sheet of paper was clipped to the back of the file. It was a new page, crisp and white, with no yellowing at the edges. The handwriting was meticulous, a clean, flowing script that was a jarring contrast to the frantic scrawls of the nurses and doctors from the 80s. The note was dated last week, and it described Mr. Chen's final days in chilling detail. Patient exhibited a sudden decline, it read. Respiratory arrest at 2:07 a.m. Patient passed peacefully. The note was signed with a neat, swirling signature that was completely unfamiliar. I stared at the page, my brow furrowed in confusion. David Chen had died in 1988. I knew this because his death certificate was right there in the file. The new note didn't contradict his death, but it described it as if it had happened just last week. The details were uncanny, the precise time of death, the specific symptoms, but they were written in a tone that was both clinical and deeply personal, as if the author had been there in the room watching him pass. I told myself it was a mistake. Someone had pulled the wrong file and accidentally left a note from a current patient in a historical document. It was a sloppy error, one that would earn them a scolding. I removed the note, filed it under administrative errors, and returned the file to Dr. Evans. He barely glanced at the contents before thanking me and leaving. My rational mind dismissed the incident as a one-off mistake, but my subconscious felt a prickle of unease. Then, a week later, it happened again. I was working on a request for a patient who had been admitted for a rare blood disorder in 1995. The file was for a little girl named Lily Morrison. As I opened the folder, I found another perfectly crisp new sheet of paper clipped inside. This note, also with that same elegant, unfamiliar handwriting, was dated yesterday. It detailed Lily's recovery from a severe depressive episode, her graduation from medical school, and her work as a pediatric neurologist. It was a detailed, heartwarming summary of a life well lived. But Lily Morrison had died in 1996 at the age of 5. Her records, which I was holding in my hands, showed a terminal diagnosis and an official cause of death. Yet, this new note, this errata, as I began to call them, painted a beautiful, impossible future. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. These weren't mistakes. The notes were too precise. The handwriting was too consistent. Something was adding to these records, but the entries were not about the past. They were about a present and future that couldn't possibly exist. I started to check files at random, pulling records from the oldest, dustiest sections of the archive. The pattern was subtle, but undeniable. The older the file, the more likely it was to contain these ghostly additions. A soldier who died of tuberculosis in 1943 had a new note describing his successful surgery and later life as a carpenter. A woman who died in childbirth in 1968 had an entry from just a few days ago, detailing her life as a proud grandmother. The notes were always meticulously written and were always for patients who had died within the hospital walls. The chilling conclusion I reached was this: the archive wasn't just a place of memory, it was a place of correction. Something was writing new histories for the dead, giving them the lives they never had. And the only place these lives existed was in the meticulous, impossible records in my sub-basement. I was the keeper of these phantom lives, and I was about to find out why. My initial unease had curdled into a full-blown obsession. The archive, once my sanctuary, now felt like a sentient entity, a vast, silent mind that watched my every move. I started spending my breaks, and often hours after my shift, pulling random files, my heart thrumming with a morbid curiosity. The errata became my sole focus. I noticed a distinct pattern. They weren't just random additions. They were responses. It was as if the very act of a living person, a doctor, a researcher, or even just me, disturbing the records of the dead somehow triggered this unseen scribe to correct the mistake of their demise. The living were asking about the dead, and with unsettling clarity, the dead were writing back. The subtle signs of its activity became almost imperceptible at first, then painfully obvious. Sometimes, as I'd be reshelving a particularly heavy file, a sudden, inexplicable gust of cold air would sweep through the usually stagnant sub-basement, carrying with it a faint, almost metallic temps. Like ozone or static electricity after a storm, the hairs on my arms would prickle. Other times, the fluorescent lights overhead, typically a steady, anemic glow, would flicker with a nervous energy that seemed to concentrate around the section I was working in. And then there was the sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like a pen on parchment. Always just beyond my field of vision, always just out of reach. A phantom echo in the oppressive silence. It was working. The scribe was working, and I was its increasingly terrified witness. I documented every instance, a parallel set of notes to the spectral ones I was finding. I recorded the date and time I pulled a file, and then the date and time an errata appeared. The correlation was undeniable. Within hours, sometimes even minutes, of a record being handled, a new, impossible entry would manifest. Take the case of Dr. Eleanor Vance. She was a renowned cardiologist, now in her late 70s, who was researching a rare congenital heart defect. She had requested the file of a child, Samuel Miller, who had died from this very condition in 1993. The original file painted a grim picture: endless hospital stays, agonizing procedures, and a premature death at age 7. It was a testament to early medical limitations, a stark reminder of lives lost. But 2 hours after Dr. Vance took the file upstairs, I found a fresh errata clipped inside. This new note, dated last week, described Samuel's miraculous survival after an experimental surgery. It chronicled his healthy adolescence, his passion for engineering, his eventual career as a biomedical researcher, dedicating his life to finding cures for heart defects. The language was clinical, yet imbued with a profound sense of triumph. I could almost hear the bustling, hopeful energy of this impossible future. Another chilling example involved a prominent medical historian, Professor Albright, who was researching the 1918 influenza pandemic. He'd requested the records of Sarah Jenkins, a young nurse who had died caring for patients during the outbreak. Her file was filled with stoic reports of her fever, her rapid decline, and the poignant detail of her last entry in the ward log, simply feeling weak. But when I retrieved the file for its return to the shelf, I found a new page inserted. It was a newspaper clipping from 1957, yellowed with age, yet feeling undeniably fresh. It celebrated the 50th anniversary of St. Michael's Hospital, featuring Sarah Jenkins, vibrant and smiling, being honored for her decades of service as the head nurse of the infectious diseases ward. The original death certificate was still there, undeniable proof of her early demise, but the errata offered a different truth. A life lived to its fullest, a quiet heroism acknowledged. The contrast between the stark reality of the original records and the beautiful, Impossible futures painted by the errata began to chip away at my sanity. The original files were full of human despair, the agonizing scrawls of doctors trying to save lives, nurses documenting inevitable losses. The errata, however, were always written in that same elegant, almost ethereal script. Detached, yet deeply compassionate, describing outcomes that defied every known law of medicine and mortality. It was a hospice for the written word, giving perfect happy endings to stories that had ended in tragedy. My attempts to find a logical explanation became increasingly desperate. I researched old hospital folklore, tales of ghosts and benevolent spirits. Nothing fit. This wasn't a mischievous poltergeist or a mournful specter. This was something meticulous, intelligent, and profoundly powerful. It was editing reality, or at least the recorded version of it. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, was the only one who knew. The realization settled over me with a terrifying weight. The archive wasn't merely reacting to being disturbed. It was a sentient being, a vast collective consciousness born from the hopes, fears, and desperate wishes contained within millions of patient files. It was a living, breathing record, and it was using its power to rewrite the stories of those who had passed within these walls. The dead weren't just haunting the place. They were being given new lives, new futures, meticulously documented in the silent depths of my sub-basement. And as the keeper of these phantom lives, I was no longer an impartial observer. I was becoming an accomplice. A gatekeeper to a reality that defied all logic. A reality that now, chillingly, seemed to be responding to my own presence. The phantom scratching, once a subtle accompaniment to the archive's silence, had become almost constant. It was a delicate, precise sound, like a quill on heavy paper, always just outside my direct line of sight. It followed me as I moved between the towering shelves, seemed to pause when I paused, and intensified. When I focused on particularly old or tragic files, the colder drafts of air grew sharper, more purposeful, often swirling around my hands as I reached for a dusty folder. It was as if the invisible scribe was directly communicating its presence, a silent acknowledgement of my growing awareness. My sanity, once a fortress of logical deduction, was slowly eroding under the relentless assault of these impossible phenomena. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the answers lay buried somewhere in the oldest parts of the archive, in the foundational documents that predated the very concept of digital records. My search began in the oldest section, a dimly lit corner where the shelves groaned under the weight of oversized leather-bound ledgers. These were the true relics of St. Michael's, some dating back to the hospital's inception in the late 19th century. They weren't patient files in the modern sense. They were massive handwritten logs of admissions, discharges, and most ominously, deaths. Each page was a testament to the early days of medicine, a stark record of suffering and the limitations of a nascent science. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, and the air in this section was heavy with the scent of extreme age, a smell that felt like history itself. I carefully pulled one such ledger from a high shelf. It was bound in thick, dark leather, its spine cracked and worn. The title, embossed in tarnished gold leaf, and then I saw it. Amidst the faded formal entries, a distinct, more fluid hand began to appear, almost subtly at first. Then, with increasing frequency, it was the same elegant, swirling script of the errata I'd been finding. It began as minor annotations, corrections to a patient's cause of death or duration of stay. A pneumonia changed to recovered, died in childbirth, altered to discharged with healthy child. These weren't new pages, but corrections within the original entries, written over the fading ink of the past. It was rewriting history, line by line, on the very fabric of the original records. But then, the annotations became something more profound. They were small appended notes, often tucked into the margins, describing not just revised outcomes, but entire fulfilled lives. A patient, John Davies, admitted for consumption in 1891 and recorded as having died that same year, now had a sprawling 2-page addendum. It detailed his recovery, his move to the frontier, his marriage. in his eventual passing in 1957, surrounded by grandchildren. The details were specific, intimate, brimming with a vividness that felt impossibly real. And beneath this sprawling narrative, in the same elegant hand, was a simple, yet profoundly disturbing signature. The Scribe. The Scribe. The name echoed in my mind, confirming my deepest fears. This wasn't a human. It was an entity, a presence, a singular consciousness that had been meticulously cataloging and now correcting lives for over a century. It was the hospital's ghost, its very soul, a being born from the collective narrative of suffering and salvation within these walls. The archive wasn't just a place for memory, it was memory made manifest, and it was using its power to rewrite the stories it didn't like. As I delved deeper into the ledger, the entries grew more revealing. There were meticulous notes on specific patient interactions, snippets of dialogue, expressions of hope, moments of quiet despair that could only have been observed by someone intimately present. The Scribe wasn't just an editor, it was a witness. It had seen every life, every death, every moment of human vulnerability within St. Michael's, and it had absorbed it all, coalescing into a singular, all-encompassing consciousness that now sought to mend the broken narratives. It was then I noticed something truly horrifying. Beyond the corrections and the appended life stories, there were entries, written in the same elegant hand, that seemed to foreshadow future events. It's not errata about the past, but brief, cryptic notes about patients who would be admitted decades later, or about architectural changes to the hospital itself. The East Wing will fall in 43, one entry read, referring to a fire that devastated part of the hospital in 1943, long before the ledger was even half filled. The Scribe wasn't just fixing the past, it was aware of the future. It was a guardian of time itself, woven into the fabric of the hospital's history. My hands trembled as I turned another page. A series of entries, all from the early 1900s, described the growing despair of patients admitted with incurable diseases, their pleas for comfort and meaning. And then a new section, a separate part of the ledger, titled The Unremembered. Here, the entries were less about individual lives and more about collective yearning. They spoke of the innate human desire for a good life, a complete story, a peaceful end. They spoke of the injustice of premature death, of suffering cut short, of futures unfulfilled. And then, a final chilling statement, written in bold, confident strokes. I write what is forgotten. I remember what should be. And I correct what is wrong. This wasn't a malicious entity. It was something profoundly sorrowful, something that had witnessed too much pain and had decided, in its own silent, powerful way, to do something about it. The Scribe was an editor of fate, a silent guardian of human narratives, rewriting the stories of the dead to give them the lives they never had. And I, Thomas Hayes, the Archivist, had stumbled upon its sacred work. The archive wasn't just a collection of faded documents. It was a living, breathing testament to a compassionate cosmic intervention. And I was now a part of its unfolding story, a witness to its impossible miracles. The scratching sound intensified, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to echo not just in the sub-basement, but in the deepest recesses of my own mind. It was working. The Scribe was working, and I was its increasingly uneasy, yet strangely captivated, guardian. The revelation of the Scribe, as the author of the errata, and indeed, the very consciousness of the archive, had shifted my understanding of my workplace from a mere storage facility to a living, breathing entity. The rhythmic scratching, once a subtle accompaniment to the sub-basement's silence, now resonated with a new, terrifying meaning. It was the sound of its work, a constant reminder of its unseen presence. I began to perceive it not just as an auditory phenomenon, but as a visceral sensation of faint pressure in the air. A whisper of cold against my cheek, even a fleeting distortion in the periphery of my vision, like a shimmer in the stagnant air. It followed me, a diligent, unseen shadow. As I moved between the towering shelves, seemed to pause when I paused, and intensified with an almost frantic energy when I focused on particularly old or tragic files. It was as if the invisible scribe was directly communicating its presence, a silent acknowledgement of my growing awareness, a tacit invitation to observe its sacred work. My sanity, once a fortress of logical deduction, was slowly eroding under the relentless assault of these impossible phenomena. Sleep had become a luxury I could no longer afford, haunted by dreams of endless corridors lined with files, one containing a life rewritten, a destiny altered. I spent most of my waking hours in the archive, driven by a morbid fascination and a desperate need to understand the full extent of this miraculous, terrifying power. I was no longer just an archivist. I was an acolyte, a bewildered observer in a silent cosmic ritual. Scratching sound was now almost constant, a delicate, precise rhythm, like a quill on heavy antique paper. It wasn't the hurried scribble of a human hand, but a deliberate, almost meditative act. I tried to pinpoint its origin. Walking slowly between the aisles, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, an omnipresent whisper that permeated the very fabric of the sub-basement. Sometimes it felt as though it was directly behind me, causing me to spin around, only to find the aisle empty, the shadows stretching long and unyielding. Other times, it echoed from the distant corners, as if the scribe was working in multiple places simultaneously, meticulously adding to its vast compendium of revised histories. I began to experiment, leaving specific files open on my desk, or deliberately placing new blank sheets of paper in the oldest ledgers. Each time, within minutes, the scratching would intensify around my workstation. And when I looked back, the pages would bear new errata, new narratives of lives redeemed. It was responding to me, acknowledging my participation, almost collaborating. The elegant handwriting, once an unsettling mystery, now felt familiar. I began to recognize subtle nuances in its strokes. The way it would emphasize certain words, the delicate flourish it would add to a particularly poignant detail. It was as if I was learning to read the language of the dead, translated through the meticulous hand of their benevolent historian. The colder drafts of air grew sharper, more purposeful. They often swirled around my hands as I reached for a dusty folder, carrying with them that faint, metallic temps. It felt like a subtle caress, a recognition, almost an encouragement. My fingers, once accustomed only to the dry, papery touch of old documents, now seemed to sense the invisible currents that heralded the scribe's activity. The air itself felt charged with its presence, thick with the weight of rewritten destinies. One night, while meticulously examining a file about a young mother who had died tragically during childbirth in 1972, I felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow wash over me. The original notes detailed her desperate struggle, the unfulfilled hopes of her family, the chilling silence that followed the birth of her stillborn child. It was a brutal, heart-wrenching account. As I read, the scratching intensified around me, a frantic, almost agitated rhythm. Then, a sudden, powerful gust of cold air slammed into the file, scattering the original pages across my desk. When the air settled, a new page lay atop the scattered documents. It described the mother's survival, her joyful reunion with a healthy child, a life filled with laughter and the warmth of family. The details were exquisite, describing the child's first steps, their graduation, their own children. And at the bottom, in the scribe's elegant hand, a single, underlined word: justice. It was then I understood the true nature of the scribe. It wasn't just a record keeper, nor was it merely a benevolent spirit. It was a force of cosmic compassion, driven by an inherent desire to correct the injustices of fate within the hospital's walls. It felt the pain of the unfulfilled lives, the sorrow of the abrupt endings, the crushing weight of lost potential. And it chose to intervene, to rewrite the narratives, to grant a spectral form of solace to those whose stories had ended in tragedy. My role, I realized, was not just to observe, was to facilitate. By interacting with the files, by bringing these forgotten stories into the light of my attention, I was inadvertently empowering the scribe, giving it the necessary focus to weave its impossible corrections. I was a living conduit, a bridge between the stark reality of what was and the hopeful truth of what could have been. But with this understanding came a new, profound fear. If the scribe could rewrite the past for the dead, what could it do for the living? Could it, in its compassionate pursuit of justice, decide to correct the narrative of someone still drawing breath. The archive, once my tranquil kingdom, now felt like a living, breathing god, its power immense, its intentions benevolent, but its methods terrifyingly beyond human comprehension. The scratching continued, a relentless symphony of rewritten fate. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, found myself irrevocably bound to its silent, ceaseless work. The dead were writing, and I was its witness, its tool, its increasingly uneasy, yet strangely compelled, accomplice. The archive, once a static repository of history, was now a dynamic living entity, its unseen scribe working tirelessly to mend broken narratives. My days, or rather my nights in the sub-basement, had become a blur of feverish research and chilling observation. I was no longer merely retrieving files, but I was studying the intricate dance between life and death, reality and possibility. As orchestrated by the Scribe, the errata, which had once felt like anomalies, were now the very pulse of this subterranean world. Each new entry, a testament to a life redeemed, a sorrow undone. But the scope of the Scribe's work, I soon realized, extended far beyond the long dead. One particularly cold Tuesday morning, while processing a batch of recently discharged patient records for long-term storage, I came across the file of a young boy named Ethan Miller. His story was fresh in my memory, a truly heartbreaking case. Ethan, only 6 years old, had been admitted a week prior with a sudden, aggressive form of pediatric leukemia, despite the heroic efforts of the medical staff. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, and he had passed away on the 4th floor just yesterday. I remembered seeing the doctor who treated him, Dr. Chen, a usually stoic man, leaving the ward with shoulders slumped, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion. The hospital staff had been visibly shaken, the kind of quiet, collective sorrow that settles over a ward when a child's life is tragically cut short. I opened Ethan's file, my heart heavy. The official records detailed his diagnosis, the failed treatments, the time of death, all the stark, agonizing facts of his brief existence. But as I flipped to the final page, a new crisp sheet of paper, bearing the familiar elegant script, was clipped to the back. My breath hitched in my throat. This errata, dated just this morning, described Ethan's miraculous recovery after a novel bone marrow transplant. It chronicled his subsequent growth into a healthy, vibrant child, his passion for astronomy, his eventual acceptance into a prestigious university, and his future work as a brilliant astrophysicist. The language was imbued with a profound sense of joy and hope, painting a picture of a life brimming with potential, a destiny fulfilled. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over me. Profound relief for this phantom life, but also a crushing sadness for the real, tragic end of Ethan Miller. I saw Dr. Chen later that day, still visibly grieving, recounting the painful details of Ethan's final hours to a sympathetic colleague, and I knew what the archive was doing. It was no longer just correcting ancient histories, it was actively intervening in recent tragedies. A spectral hospice for the written word, giving perfect, happy endings to stories that had ended, in our reality, in unbearable sorrow. The pattern repeated itself with disturbing frequency. I found an errata in the file of Maria Sanchez, a vibrant young woman who had died 2 weeks ago from complications following a routine surgery. The original records documented her sudden, unexpected decline, the frantic efforts to resuscitate her, and the raw grief of her husband and 2 small children. The errata, dated yesterday, painted a picture of her complete recovery, her return home to her loving family, and her eventual decision to pursue a career in nursing, inspired by the care she had received at St. Michael's. Then there was Robert Jenkins, an elderly patient who had lingered for months in the ICU before finally succumbing to a severe stroke. His actual file was a thick dossier of grim prognoses and medical interventions. But the Scribe's errata, appearing just a few days after his death, detailed his full recovery, his return to his beloved garden, and his final, peaceful passing at home surrounded by his entire family decades later. Each errata was a meticulously crafted counter-narrative, a testament to what should have been rather than what was. The chilling implication was clear. The scribe wasn't content with just tidying up ancient injustices. It was reaching into the present, into the raw, fresh wounds of loss, and attempting to heal them, not in the tangible world, but within the pages of the archive. It was a silent, compassionate God residing in the sub-basement. Tending to the emotional scars of the hospital, my role in this cosmic drama became increasingly unsettling. By simply handling these files, by focusing my attention on the stories of the recently deceased, I was perhaps providing the scribe with the necessary connection, the emotional resonance it needed to weave its impossible corrections. I was a living bridge, a conduit between the brutal reality of the wards above and the rewritten destinies below. The scratching sound, now almost a constant murmur in my ears, felt less like an unseen presence and more like a collaboration, a silent partnership in this profound act of cosmic empathy. But the question that gnawed at my mind, a relentless, icy tendril of fear, was this? What was the cost of this rewritten reality? These new lives, vibrant and hopeful within the pages of the archive, existed only there. The grief of Dr. Chen, the anguish of Maria Sanchez's family, the quiet sorrow of Robert Jenkins's children, these were real, tangible emotions in the world above. Was the scribe merely creating beautiful illusions? Or was it, in some unfathomable way, preparing a different kind of reality? The archive, once my refuge, was now a place of profound moral ambiguity. It was a hospice for the written word, yes, but it was also a silent witness to a truth that transcended human understanding. A truth that I, Thomas Hayes, was now irrevocably entangled in. The scratching continued, a relentless symphony of rewritten fate, and I, the archivist, found myself increasingly compelled, yet terrified, by the impossible beauty of the unseen patients. My sleep, already fractured by the archive's chilling revelations, became a battlefield where the boundaries of reality dissolved. The hum of the climate control unit, once a soothing white noise, transformed into a low, discordant drone that seemed to vibrate directly within my skull, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at play. The scent of aging paper, once comforting, now carried a subtle undertone of something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood or the ghost of a fading memory. The sub-basement, once a fortress of logical order, now felt like a vast breathing maw, slowly consuming my grasp on the tangible world. My dreams were no longer just fragmented echoes of my waking anxieties. They were vivid, immersive experiences within the scribe's dominion. The archive, in these nocturnal visions, was different. It wasn't the ordered labyrinth of steel shelves and dusty files I knew. Instead, the shelves stretched into infinity, disappearing into a swirling vortex of shadow and light, each segment pulsating with a faint internal luminescence. The files were not for people. They were for concepts. Massive, ancient tomes, bound in materials I couldn't identify, labeled with abstract, unsettling titles. Love, grief, hope, madness, sanity. Each tome, when I dared to touch it in my dreams, felt cold and heavy, resonating with a profound, unspoken weight. The most terrifying aspect was the emptiness. When I managed to open a file, particularly those labeled with positive, life-affirming concepts like love or hope, they were utterly blank. The pages were pristine, untouched, radiating a chilling void. It was as if these fundamental human experiences, though documented in the archive's ethereal form, were somehow unwritten, unlived, within this alternate reality. The emptiness was not just a lack of content, it was a profound, aching absence, a gaping wound in the very fabric of existence. Conversely, when I opened the files labeled with concepts like grief or madness, they were overflowing. Thousands upon thousands of pages, densely packed with minuscule, frantic handwriting, so tight and overlapping that it was impossible to decipher. The ink seemed to writhe on the page, like trapped insects, a visual representation of raw, uncontained anguish. The sheer volume of these entries, the palpable despair emanating from them, was overwhelming. It felt like holding the accumulated suffering of every soul that had ever passed through St. Michael's, distilled into pure, agonizing text. The dream archive, I realized with a jolt of terror, was a record of everything that had been lost, everything that had gone wrong, everything that humanity struggled to comprehend or contain. During one particularly harrowing dream, I found myself standing before the sanity file. It was a slender, almost transparent volume. Barely discernible amidst the towering shelves of madness and despair, with trembling hands, I reached for it. As my fingers brushed against its cover, it crumbled to dust, a fine, glittering powder that drifted down to cover the floor of the dream archive. The profound silence that followed was even more deafening than the cacophony of the grief files. Sanity, it seemed, was the most fragile and easily lost of all concepts within this spectral library. The boundaries between my waking life and these unsettling dreams began to blur. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom scent of old paper and ozone clinging to my sheets, the phantom scratching echoing in my ears. I'd find myself scrutinizing the real files in the archive, expecting to see the impossible labels, the overflowing despair, the terrifying emptiness. My colleagues, when I interacted with them during my brief forays upstairs, noticed my increasing gauntness, the dark circles under my eyes, the distant, haunted look in my gaze. "Thomas, you look like you haven't slept in weeks," my supervisor, a kindly but oblivious man named Mr. Henderson, remarked one afternoon. "Are you taking your vacations?" I could only offer a weak smile, unable to articulate the cosmic horror that was slowly unspooling in the depths of my workplace, and now in the depths of my own mind. The Scribe, it seemed, was not just rewriting the past for the dead. It was also influencing the present of the living, subtly altering my perception, blurring the edges of my reality. The cold drafts in the archive became more frequent, more intentional, often swirling around my head as if whispering secrets directly into my ears. I started hearing faint, almost subliminal voices in the rustle of old paper, the murmur of indistinguishable words that seemed to be pulled from the depths of those overflowing grief files. They were not malicious, not threatening, but profoundly sad, a chorus of forgotten lamentations. My grasp on what was real and what was imagined was tenuous at best. I would often pause in the middle of a task, my hand hovering over a file, convinced that the spectral labels from my dreams were somehow visible to my waking eyes. I began to fear that the archive, in its benevolent yet terrifying desire to correct what was wrong, was slowly absorbing me, that my consciousness was becoming another entry in its endless, impossible ledgers. The scratching continued, a relentless symphony of rewritten fate and unraveling sanity. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, found myself irrevocably bound to its silent, ceaseless work. The archive wasn't just a place of memory, it was a place where reality itself was becoming a fluid, editable text, and I was losing my mind one rewritten page at a time. The knowledge of these unseen patients, these phantom lives, was too heavy a burden for a single mortal mind to bear. The dreams were a warning, or perhaps a prelude to my own inclusion in the Scribe's increasingly complex and terrifyingly comprehensive record of what is and what should be. The blurring lines between my waking life and the archive's dreamscape had become a constant source of terror. The profound weight of the Scribe's work, the knowledge of countless rewritten destinies, and the sheer volume of grief and madness I glimpsed in my dreams were pressing down on my mind, threatening to crush it. My colleagues' concerned glances, their whispered suggestions of time off or stress leave, only reinforced my growing isolation. How could I explain that my workplace was a sentient entity, a cosmic editor of fate, and that my own sanity was slowly unraveling within its pages? The idea, once a fleeting, paranoid thought, now solidified into an icy conviction. I had to find my own file. It was a desperate, illogical impulse, a primal need to understand my place in this impossible narrative. If the archive was rewriting the dead, if it was recording concepts, then surely it had a record of me. Not just my employee file, a sterile document of my hiring date and salary, but a true personal file detailing my life, my history, perhaps even my destiny as perceived by the Scribe. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. It was a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control, Understand if I too was merely another unwritten concept, another blank page in the grand, terrifying ledger of St. Michael's. I started my search cautiously, telling myself it was a logical extension of my research into the Scribe's patterns. I began with the employee archives, a section located slightly apart from the main patient files. Closer to the surface-level administrative offices, it was a mundane collection of personnel records, filled with the usual paperwork. Applications, performance reviews, health insurance forms. I found my own employee record, of course, a thick manila folder labeled simply Hayes Thomas, Archivist. It was sterile, impersonal, detailing my 22 years of diligent, unremarkable service. This wasn't what I was looking for. This was the superficial record, the official narrative. The phantom scratching intensified as I delved deeper, moving away from the employee records and into the older, more obscure sections of the patient archive. The air grew colder. The fluorescent lights flickered with a more aggressive, insistent rhythm. It was as if the scribe knew what I was searching for, its unseen presence a palpable hum of anticipation. I moved slowly, methodically, my flashlight beams sweeping across rows of dusty, faded labels. I bypassed files categorized by medical specialty, by date of admission, by ward. I was looking for something more fundamental, something that transcended the standard classifications. I remembered the concept files from my dreams. Love, grief, sanity. They weren't physically present in the real archive, but their spectral labels lingered in my mind. What if my own personal file wasn't under a traditional medical designation? What if it was classified under something else entirely? Something tied to my role? My presence in this place? My search led me to the deepest, most forgotten part of the archive. A section marked only by a hand-painted sign from decades past. Miscellaneous. It was a section reserved for records that defied easy categorization. Old architectural blueprints, forgotten hospital policies, donation ledgers, and a scattering of truly ancient personal effects that had been inexplicably preserved. The air here was heavy, still, and permeated with a profound sense of antiquity. The shelves were not steel, but thick dark wood, warped with age, groaning under the weight of forgotten histories. It was there, tucked away in a dusty corner, behind a stack of brittle patient photographs from the 1930s, that I found it. A small, unassuming manila folder, much thinner than most. It had no specific classification, no patient ID number. Just a handwritten label, almost entirely faded, but still legible. Thomas H. My breath hitched. It was my name, my initial, written in a hand that was not the scribe's elegant script, nor my own careful block letters, but something older, less refined. It looked like the handwriting of a child, my handwriting, from a time I barely remembered. My hands trembled as I reached for the file. The cold air swirled around my fingers, carrying with it a faint, sweet smell like old parchment and something else. Something indescribably innocent, yet deeply melancholic. The scratching sound, which had been a constant presence, suddenly ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, almost suffocating. It was as if the scribe itself had paused its work, waiting. I carried the file back to my desk, its lightness feeling ominous in my grasp. The single fluorescent bulb above my head flickered nervously as I laid it down. With a profound sense of dread, I opened the folder. Inside, there was a single, yellowed sheet of paper. It was a medical intake form, the kind used for pediatric admissions in the late 1970s, around the time I would have been a child. My name was there, Thomas Hayes, along with my date of birth. The diagnosis field was blank. The treatment plan was blank. The discharge summary was blank. Every single entry on the form, meant to document a child's health journey, was utterly, terrifyingly empty. The file was a blank slate, a void. It was as if I had been admitted to this hospital as a child, and my entire medical history had simply vanished, or perhaps had never been written. I stared at the pristine, empty page, my mind reeling. No records of childhood illnesses, no immunizations, no routine checkups, nothing. Just my name and a date, floating on a sea of unwritten history. No, this wasn't an errata from the scribe, no hopeful rewritten future. This was a profound, aching absence, a gaping hole in my own past. It was a different kind of correction, a different kind of justice, enacted not by adding, but by erasing. The file contained nothing else. No notes, no lab results, no doctor's observations. Just a single, empty form bearing my name. And it made me feel a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-basement's perpetual cold. This wasn't just a missing record. It was a profound, disturbing statement. It was as if the scribe had decided that my life, my history, was not yet worthy of its grand narrative. Or more chillingly, that my story was yet to be written, and perhaps it was waiting to be the author. The archive, I realized, was not just about the dead. It was about me. And the terrifying emptiness of my file was a prelude to whatever unwritten fate awaited me within its silent, watchful walls. My own past was a blank page, and the scribe, the benevolent yet terrifying editor, was waiting for the story to unfold. The emptiness of my own file, a stark white canvas amidst millions of meticulously documented lives, had struck me with a chill more profound than any ghostly draft or phantom scratching. It was a vacuum, a void in my personal history, and it hummed with a silent question that echoed the very core of my being. Why was I unwritten? The scribe, this cosmic editor of fate, had seen fit to give happy endings to countless tragedies, to fill the blank spaces of untimely deaths with vibrant, impossible futures. But my own past, my own entry in this grand ledger of St. Michael's, was a terrifying tabula rasa. It was as if my story had not yet begun, or worse, had been deliberately erased. The next few days were a blur of frantic anxiety and unsettling anticipation. I couldn't focus on my regular duties. Every file I handled felt lighter. Every ledger I opened seemed to whisper. The archive, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, silence pressing down with the weight of unwritten possibilities. I kept returning to my desk, staring at the thin, unassuming folder labeled Thomas H., as if by sheer force of will, I could conjure meaning onto its blank page. The phantom scratching, which had ceased when I first opened my file, had returned, but it was different now. It was sharper, more insistent, almost aggressive, as if the scribe was impatient, eager for my story to finally unfold. Then, last week, it happened. I was sitting at my desk, deep in the quiet hours after midnight, lost in a haze of caffeine and existential dread. The single fluorescent bulb above me flickered with its usual nervous energy, casting dancing shadows across the rows of files. The sub-basement felt colder than usual, a pervasive chill that seemed to seep into my bones, defying the climate control. The phantom scratching was loud now, a furious, rapid scritch-scratch that resonated from directly behind me, from the very shelf where my own file had been nestled. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, a primal fear seizing me. The shelf was bathed in a faint ethereal glow, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to emanate from within the narrow gap where Thomas H. rested. With trembling hands, I reached for it. The cold air swirled around my fingers, a biting current that felt like an electric shock. I pulled the file out, its thinness now feeling incredibly heavy, charged with an invisible weight. Back at my desk, under the flickering bulb, I opened the folder. My gaze fell instantly upon it. A new page. Crisp, stark white, a jarring contrast to the aged yellow of the original intake form. The handwriting was unmistakable, that same elegant swirling script that belonged to the scribe. It was meticulously written, clinical in its precision, yet imbued with a chilling finality that made my blood run cold. The entry was dated tomorrow. My eyes scanned the words, each one a hammer blow to my fragile composure. Patient, Hayes, Thomas, age 48. Admission date, current date. It was already marking me as a patient even before the entry was complete. Diagnosis, accidental trauma, severe cranial fracture with subdural hemorrhage. Prognosis, fatal observations. Patient discovered at 3:17 a.m. in sub-basement archives, appears to have fallen from a significant height while attempting to retrieve a file from a high shelf. Impact with concrete flooring, no signs of struggle. Death instantaneous. Notes, cause of death, consistent with an unfortunate solitary workplace incident. No external factors identified. Disposition: body removed by emergency services at 4 a.m. File closed. Signed, the Scribe. The words blurred before my eyes, then snapped back into agonizing focus. Fatal. Death. Instantaneous. Tomorrow. It wasn't an errata that offered a hopeful, rewritten future. It was a meticulously detailed death certificate, written in advance by an entity that claimed to correct what was wrong. But this wasn't a correction. This was a prophecy. A chilling, undeniable roadmap to my own demise. The time of death, 3:17 a.m., resonated with a horrifying familiarity. It was the exact time that Margaret Holloway and Sarah Mills had their impossible notes appear in the old transcriptions. The same hour when the veil between realities seemed too thin. The cold that permeated the sub-basement now felt like a shroud. The phantom scratching, though no longer directly behind me, seemed to echo from within the very words on the page, a chilling symphony of my impending doom. The Scribe, this benevolent cosmic editor, had not given me a happy ending. It had given me a timeline, a precise, unchangeable schedule for my own demise. And then, the most terrifying realization hit me. The description of my death, fallen from a significant height while attempting to retrieve a file from a high shelf. I had been doing just that. Countless times for 22 years. It was a common occurrence, a mundane risk of the job. But now, it was a weapon. The Scribe wasn't just predicting, it was orchestrating. It was using my own routines, my own habits, against me. The archive, once my kingdom, was now my tomb, and I, Thomas Hayes. The Archivist was its next, meticulously documented, and utterly helpless victim. The blank page in my file was no longer a void of unwritten past. It was a terrifying canvas for an unavoidable future. The new page, my own death certificate, written in the elegant, unfeeling script of the Scribe, lay before me like a death warrant. Tomorrow, the word pulsed in my vision, a malevolent beacon guiding me to an inescapable doom. My body was cold, a primal terror seizing every nerve ending. But my mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of fragmented thoughts, desperately seeking a loophole, a way to defy the meticulous prophecy. The archive, once a source of wonder and chilling fascination, had become an active, hostile presence. Its benevolent nature twisted into a terrifying precision aimed directly at me. The details were precise, unnervingly so. Accidental trauma, severe cranial fracture with subdural hemorrhage, fallen from a significant height while attempting to retrieve a file from a high shelf, impact with concrete flooring, no signs of struggle, death instantaneous. Every word was a calculated blow, describing a death that, in its mundane horror, was all the more terrifying. It wasn't a monstrous beast or a vengeful spirit. It was an everyday tragedy, elevated to the status of cosmic inevitability by the Scribe's hand. The time, 3:17 a.m., the very hour that new errata appeared, moment the veil between realities seemed to thin, the witching hour of the archive. This wasn't just a prediction, it was a scheduled event, a precise appointment with death. The implication sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The Scribe wasn't simply observing and correcting, it was orchestrating. It was using my routines, my habits, my entire life as the raw material for its final, horrific entry. My 22 years of diligent service in this sub-basement had not merely been a career. They had been a slow, unwitting preparation for my own demise. Documented in advance, panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm me. I stumbled away from my desk, knocking over a stack of old ledgers that clattered loudly. The sudden noise, a jarring intrusion in the suffocating silence. My flashlight, clutched in a shaking hand, cast frantic dancing shadows on the towering shelves, making them seem to writhe and lean in, pressing down on me. I felt a desperate, irrational urge to flee, to run from the archive, from the hospital, from the very city itself. But where would I go? The Scribe's reach, I knew, extended far beyond these walls, was woven into the fabric of time and memory. This wasn't a place I could escape. It was a destiny I had to face. My mind raced, frantically searching for an answer, a counter-narrative to the Scribe's grim prophecy. The entity, in its benevolent corrections, had always given the dead a better future. So why was my future so bleak? Was this a punishment? A final, twisted form of justice for my intrusion into its sacred work? Or was it, as the previous errata had suggested, a warning? An impossible, terrifying chance to avert my fate. I started to scrutinize the details of the entry again, desperate for any ambiguity, any crack in its seamless inevitability. Appears to have fallen from a significant height while attempting to retrieve a file from a high shelf. This was my job, my daily routine. Retrieving files from high shelves was a constant. I used the old, rickety rolling ladder, its wheels squealing a protest on the linoleum. I knew its every creak, its every wobble, but it had never failed me, not once in 22 years. I looked at the ladder now, leaning against a far shelf, a mundane object transformed into a harbinger of doom. It was old, certainly its wood worn smooth by decades of hands, its metal rungs chipped and dull. Could I simply avoid it, refuse to climb it? Yes, that was it. If I didn't climb, I couldn't fall. If I didn't retrieve a file from a high shelf, the prophecy could not come true. A tiny flicker of hope ignited within me, fragile but fierce. But then, another terrifying thought materialized, whispered by the archive's insidious silence. No signs of struggle. Death instantaneous. This implied a sudden, unexpected event, not a conscious avoidance. What if the fall wasn't accidental? What if the Scribe, in its intricate orchestration, simply made me fall? What if the very act of knowing my fate was part of its insidious plan, drawing me closer to the moment of impact, to the precise coordinates of my demise? The hope flickered and threatened to extinguish. I paced the aisles, a caged animal, my breath ragged in the cold, dusty air. The phantom scratching had resumed, a soft, relentless rhythm that seemed to mock my frantic thoughts. It was calmer now, almost satisfied, as if the Scribe knew my futile struggles were just part of the unfolding narrative, another detail to be meticulously recorded. I felt its unseen presence all around me, a profound, intelligent awareness that permeated every particle of dust, every fiber of old paper. It was watching, it was waiting. Then, a fragment from one of my dreams surfaced, a chilling echo from the sanity file, which had crumbled to dust at my touch. Sanity, it seemed, was the most fragile and easily lost of all concepts within this spectral library. Was this the Scribe's ultimate goal? To drive me mad with knowledge, to force me into a confrontation with an inevitable fate, until my mind, like the sanity file, simply disintegrated? I pulled out my phone, its modern glow a stark contrast to the archaic gloom of the archive. My fingers fumbled as I tried to call for help, to report what I'd found, to warn someone. But to whom? How do you explain a death certificate written by a sentient archive? How do you articulate a prophecy delivered by the ghost of institutional memory? My hands trembled, the screen blurred. My contacts list, once a lifeline, now seemed utterly meaningless. Who would believe me? They would attribute it to stress, to fatigue, to the isolation of the sub-basement, just as my supervisor had. I would become another case, another entry in the psychiatric records upstairs. My descent into madness, meticulously documented. The time on my phone glared back at me. 2:15 a.m. Barely an hour until the appointed time. The cold was unbearable now, a physical ache that gnawed at my bones. I looked at the high shelves, stretching upwards into the dimness, hundreds of thousands of files containing forgotten lives, rewritten destinies, and now, my own chilling prophecy. I looked at the rolling ladder, a silent, waiting sentinel. The Scribe had given me a warning, an impossible, terrifying glimpse into my own meticulously documented end. But a warning without the means to avert it was merely a torment. Or was it? What if the warning itself was the means? What if knowing was the only weapon I had? The Scribe was orchestrating. Perhaps it could also be outsmarted. I had 1 hour. 1 hour to rewrite my own history before the Scribe closed my file forever? The phantom scratching intensified, a chorus of unseen pens, and I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, stood at the precipice of my own unwritten yet terrifyingly documented fate. The prophecy was clear, chillingly precise. 3:17 a.m. Barely an hour remained until the moment of my documented demise. My mind, a frantic whirlwind of terror and desperate logic, clung to the last shred of hope. What if this impossible warning was, in fact, an invitation? A test? The Scribe, in its cosmic benevolence, had always offered a better future to the dead. Could it be extending the same impossible grace to me? A chance to alter my own tragic narrative? Or was I merely a pawn in a larger, incomprehensible game? My every struggle a prescripted act in the Scribe's grand design? My breath hitched in my throat, ragged and cold in the sterile air of the sub-basement. My eyes darted around the labyrinthian aisles, seeking any anomaly, any detail that could offer a clue, a path to defiance. The fluorescent lights overhead, typically a steady, anemic glow, were now flickering with a nervous intensity that mirrored my own frantic pulse. Each brief flicker plunged the vast archive into deeper shadow, making the towering shelves seem to lean in, menacing and judgmental. The phantom scratching, once a distant murmur, had escalated into a furious, relentless symphony of unseen pens, a cacophony of spectral documentation that seemed to resonate directly within my skull. It was as if the Scribe was working at a fever pitch, preparing for the culmination of its latest, most personal entry. I knew I couldn't just stand there, waiting for the inevitable. The prophecy specifically mentioned attempting to retrieve a file from a high shelf. My eyes locked onto the rolling ladder, leaning innocuously against a distant aisle. It was old, its wooden rungs worn smooth, its wheels a dull, rusty metal. It was a mundane object, but now in the flickering light it seemed to glow with a malevolent, magnetic pull. I could simply avoid it, I told myself. Stay away from any high shelves. Stick to the lower aisles. The chilling detail. No signs of struggle. Death instantaneous. Replayed in my mind. It suggested a sudden, unavoidable event, not a conscious choice. What if the fall wasn't accidental at all? What if the Scribe, in its intricate orchestration, simply made me fall regardless of my actions? What if my very presence in the archive, my very knowledge of the prophecy, was the invisible thread pulling me towards my doom? A sudden sharp drop in temperature made me shiver violently. The cold was no longer just pervasive, it was localized, swirling directly behind me, a physical presence pressing against my back. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, but the aisle was empty. Only endless rows of silent, watchful files. But then, I caught a glimpse in the polished surface of a steel filing cabinet near my desk. It was a distortion, a fleeting ripple in the metal, but for a fraction of a second, I saw something. A figure. It was indistinct at first, a shifting shadow, a deeper stain in the already profound darkness of the archive. But as I stared, heart pounding, it began to solidify, to coalesce, taking on a form that was undeniably, terrifyingly familiar. It was a man, dressed in the same drab, practical Archivist uniform I wore. His posture was slightly stooped, his shoulders burdened, much like my own had become over 2 decades in this sub-basement. And then he turned. His face was mine, but older, gaunter. His eyes, though dark and hollowed, held a profound ancient weariness, a knowledge that had seen too much. His hair, once a sandy brown, was now a shocking white at the temples, receding sharply. He was me, or a version of me, shadow version. He was sitting at my desk, my very own desk. In his hands, he held a massive leather-bound ledger, the same patient log. I had discovered the one signed the Scribe. His fingers, gnarled and stained with ink, moved with meticulous precision, writing in that familiar, elegant script. He was writing, he was the Scribe, or he was becoming it. I watched, frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. My shadow self, or this future, inevitable version of me, was meticulously documenting. Was he writing my past? Or was he, as the Scribe, completing the final entry of my future? The lines of reality, already so blurred, now fractured completely. Was I seeing a ghost? A vision? Or was this a terrifying mirror, reflecting the inescapable destiny that awaited me? The cold around me intensified, pressing in, stealing the air from my lungs. The phantom scratching in the distance ceased, replaced by the soft, rhythmic scrape of the pen, held by my shadow self. It was a singular, focused sound now, the sound of an entry being made, a life being filed away. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes, my eyes, meeting mine through the distorted reflection. There was no malice in his gaze, only a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. And then he smiled. It was a thin, weary smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile of resignation and acceptance. He raised the ledger slightly, turning a page. And in that brief, horrifying moment, I saw it. At the top of the newly opened page, in that familiar, elegant script, was my name, Thomas Hayes. He wasn't just observing, he wasn't just correcting. He was the author of my fate, the keeper of my unwritten history. And the shadow version of me, older, wearier, ink-stained, was the scribe itself, trapped in an endless cycle of documentation. My blank file, my unwritten past, was merely waiting for him to fill it, waiting for me to fill it. The prophecy wasn't just a warning, it was an initiation, and I, Thomas Hayes, was about to become the very entity that had tormented me, the architect of my own undoing. The archive was not just where records were kept, it was where destinies were made and remade in an endless, terrifying loop. The cold now wrapped around me completely, a final embrace, and the scratching resumed. Now echoing directly from within my own mind, I was no longer an archivist. I was the next page. The reflection solidified, no longer a fleeting distortion, but a stark, undeniable presence. My older, gaunter self sat at my desk, meticulously inscribing my name into the ancient ledger. The phantom scratching, now a singular, deliberate scrape of quill on parchment, resonated not from the walls, but from within my own skull, a chilling echo of a destiny already written. The cold that had permeated the sub-basement now wrapped around me completely, suffocating embrace that stole the air from my lungs. I was not merely observing, I was being absorbed, drawn into the terrifying loop of the scribe's existence. My mind, a maelstrom of terror and a desperate, illogical defiance, struggled to grasp the impossible truth. This wasn't a ghost, not a vision. This was me. A future me, or perhaps a timeless me, inextricably bound to the archive, to the scribe. And he, this shadow version, was writing my end. The death certificate, dated for tomorrow, now felt less like a prediction and more like a final, meticulous instruction. Why? The word tore from my throat, raw and desperate, an alien sound in the oppressive silence. It echoed, not from the concrete walls, but from within the reflection itself, a faint, weary whisper that was undeniably my own voice, but aged, burdened by centuries of unseen toil. "Why are you doing this?" repeated, my voice cracking, my flashlight beam trembling as I pointed it at the steel cabinet. At the shimmering image of my older self, the figure in the reflection paused, his hand hovering over the ledger. His eyes, dark and hollowed, met mine through the distorted metal, and in their depths, I saw not malice, but a profound, ancient sorrow. He was a prisoner as much as a scribe, a victim as much as an orchestrator. He was me, trapped. Then, a chorus of whispers erupted, not from the reflection, but from the very air around me, from the towering shelves themselves. It was a cacophony of voices, a blend of the countless patients whose lives the scribe had rewritten. The child who died of leukemia, the young mother lost in childbirth, the soldier felled by tuberculosis. Their voices, once distinct in the errata, now merged into a single, resonant murmur, a collective consciousness speaking through the archive itself. "We write what is forgotten," the chorus whispered, the words swirling around me like a cold, invisible wind. "We remember what should be, and we correct what is wrong." The words were not accusatory, but explanatory, a profound, chilling revelation. The scribe wasn't malevolent, it was a force of cosmic compassion, an entity born from the collective suffering and unfulfilled desires of every soul that had passed through St. Michael's. It was the hospital's conscience, its institutional memory made manifest, striving to mend the broken narratives of human existence. "You intruded," the whispers continued, now more focused, more directed at me. "You saw what was not meant for the living. You touched the threads of fate." My mind reeled. My curiosity, my desperate need to understand, had led me here to this terrifying confrontation. I had become a living conduit, a bridge between the stark reality of the wards above and the rewritten destinies below. And in doing so, I had become part of the Scribe's grand design. The blank page in your file, the chorus murmured, its voice tinged with an inexplicable sadness, was a choice. An opportunity to write your own story, free from the burdens of fate. But you sought answers. You sought knowledge. Is a double-edged pen. I looked down at my own file, still open on my desk, the pristine white death certificate mocking me with its meticulously inscribed details. But why this? I pleaded, pointing at the prophecy. Why my death? If you correct what is wrong, why not correct this? The shadow version of me in the reflection slowly lowered the ledger. His gaze, weary and knowing, locked with mine. And then he spoke, his voice a dry, papery whisper that seemed to come from centuries of accumulated dust and sorrow. Some stories, he said, the words barely audible, must be written. Some roles must be filled. The archive demands a keeper, a scribe. The chorus of voices intensified, swirling around me, each word a chilling confirmation. We need a hand, a mind. To observe, to document, to correct. I looked at my reflection. At the older, ink-stained version of myself, his fingers gnarled, his eyes ancient. He was not just the scribe. He was a part of the scribe, a living extension of its will, trapped in an endless cycle of documentation. He was the archivist, the keeper, the one who bore the burden of countless rewritten lives. And he was waiting for me to take his place. The prophecy wasn't a warning to be averted. It was an initiation, a transfer of power. My death wasn't an accident. It was a transition, a transformation. The archive needed a new scribe, a new hand to wield the pen of fate. And I, Thomas Hayes, with my 22 years of meticulous service, my obsession with order, my desperate need to understand, was the perfect candidate. The cold now intensified to an unbearable degree, a final, suffocating embrace. The phantom scratching, once a distant murmur, now echoed directly from within my own mind, a relentless symphony of rewritten fate and unraveling sanity. My fingers, once trembling with fear, now felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards the ancient ledger on the desk. The blank page in my file was no longer a void of unwritten past. It was a terrifying canvas for an unavoidable future, a future where I would become the very entity that had tormented me, the architect of my own undoing. The archive was not just where records were kept, it was where destinies were made and remade. In an endless, terrifying loop, and I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, was about to become the next page, the next scribe. The chorus of whispers, a symphony of forgotten voices swirled around me, each word a chilling confirmation of the impossible truth. The scribe was not a malevolent entity, but a force of cosmic compassion, an entity born from the collective suffering and unfulfilled desires of every soul that had passed through St. Michael's. It was the hospital's conscience, its institutional memory made manifest. Tirelessly striving to mend the broken narratives of human existence, the cold, once a source of terror, now felt like a profound ancient sorrow, a tangible manifestation of the archive's immense empathy. We write what is forgotten, we remember what should be, and we correct what is wrong. The words resonated deep within my bones, an undeniable truth that transcended all logic. The scribe, I realized, was a silent guardian, a cosmic editor of fate, driven by an inherent desire to alleviate the pain of unfulfilled lives. It felt the crushing weight of lost potential, the agony of abrupt endings, the quiet despair of futures cut short, and in its boundless compassion, it chose to intervene, to rewrite the narratives. To grant a spectral form of solace to those whose stories had ended in tragedy, the errata were not mere illusions. They were acts of profound, impossible grace, giving the dead the lives they never had. My intrusion, my desperate search for answers, had not been a transgression, but a necessary step. You intruded, the whispers reiterated, now tinged with a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. You saw what was not meant for the living. You touched the threads of fate, my curiosity, my meticulous nature, my 22 years of quiet dedication to this archive. They had all been part of an intricate design, slow, unwitting preparation for this very moment. I had become a living conduit, a bridge between the brutal reality of the wards above and the rewritten destinies below. By simply handling the files, by focusing my attention on the stories of the dead, I had inadvertently empowered the scribe, providing the emotional resonance it needed to weave its impossible corrections. The blank page in my file, the terrifying void in my own past, was not a punishment. The blank page in your file, the chorus murmured, its voice tinged with an inexplicable sadness, was a choice, an opportunity. To write your own story, free from the burdens of fate. But you sought answers. You sought knowledge. Here is a double-edged pen. My unwritten history was an invitation, a canvas for self-determination. But my human need for understanding, my archivist's impulse to categorize and comprehend, had led me down a different path. I had chosen knowledge, and with it, an inescapable fate. But why this? I had pleaded, pointing at the death certificate, my own meticulously inscribed end. Why my death? If you correct what is wrong, why not correct this? The shadow version of me, the scribe, lowered the ancient ledger, his gaze weary and knowing, locked with mine. His voice, a dry, papery whisper from centuries of accumulated dust and sorrow, provided the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle. Some stories, he said, the words barely audible, must be written. Some roles must be filled. The archive demands a keeper, a scribe. The chorus of voices intensified, swirling around me, each word a chilling confirmation. We need a hand, a mind, to observe, to document, to correct. The archive was a living entity, but it was also a system, a vast, intricate mechanism that required a physical presence, human touch, to interact with the tangible records. It needed an archivist. It needed a scribe. And my death, the prophecy of my fall from the high shelf, was not an accident. It was an initiation, a transfer of power, my transformation. The cold now intensified to an unbearable degree, a final, suffocating embrace that felt less like death and more like a profound, irreversible merging. The phantom scratching, once a distant murmur, now echoed directly from within my own mind, a relentless symphony of rewritten fate and unraveling sanity. My fingers, once trembling with fear, now felt a strange, almost magnetic pull towards the ancient ledger on the desk. The blank page in my file was no longer a void of unwritten past. It was a terrifying canvas for an unavoidable future, a future where I would become the very entity that had tormented me, the architect of my own undoing. I was not merely replacing the previous archivist, I was becoming him. I was becoming them. The countless scribes who had preceded me, each drawn into this eternal role, each a living extension of the scribe's will. The older, gaunter version of myself in the reflection was not just a vision. He was my predecessor, the one whose shift was ending, whose burden was about to be transferred. His weary smile was not one of malice, but of resignation, of a profound, ancient understanding that I was now privy to. The archive was not just where records were kept, it was where destinies were made and remade in an endless, terrifying loop. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, was about to become the next page, the next scribe. The weight of this realization was crushing, yet strangely, a sense of profound calm began to settle over me. The terror remained, but it was now intertwined with a dawning, horrifying acceptance. My life, my purpose, was no longer my own. It was bound to the archive, to the endless task of correcting what was wrong, of remembering what should be. The cold was no longer just external, it was internal, a part of my very essence, a chilling, eternal presence. I was becoming the institutional memory of St. Michael's, a silent, unseen guardian, forever bound to the whispers of the dead. The crushing weight of my impending transformation, the horrifying realization that my death was not an end, but a terrifying initiation, had settled over me with an almost physical force. The cold, once a mere atmospheric discomfort, now felt like a part of me, seeping into my very bones, chilling my blood. The phantom scratching, a constant symphony within my skull, was no longer a source of terror, but a rhythmic pulse, a new heartbeat for a destiny I could no longer escape. My mind, once a fortress of logic, was now a porous membrane, absorbing the archive's ancient wisdom, its profound sorrow, its relentless purpose. I was becoming the Scribe. Yet, a flicker of my old self, a desperate spark of human defiance, still stubbornly clung to the fading edges of my consciousness. The blank page in my file, the terrifying void in my past, had been an invitation, a choice. And even now, on the precipice of my transformation, I felt an overwhelming urge to exercise that choice, to write my own story, to defy the meticulously inscribed prophecy of my death. If the Scribe corrected what was wrong, perhaps I, as its nascent successor, could correct my own fate. It was a desperate gamble, a final act of rebellion against the cosmic editor. With trembling fingers now feeling strangely elongated and cold, I reached for my open file. The pristine white death certificate, dated for tomorrow, seemed to glow with a malevolent light. I pushed it aside, revealing the blank intake form beneath. This was my canvas. This was my last stand. I picked up my pen, the same pen I had used for 22 years, its familiar weight, a fleeting comfort. But as my fingers closed around it, a strange sensation coursed through me. The pen felt different, heavier, colder, almost alive. Its tip seemed to hum with a faint internal energy, a subtle vibration that resonated with the phantom scratching in my mind. It was no longer just my pen, it was the pen, the instrument of the Scribe. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air of the archive filling my lungs with a metallic temps. I focused all my remaining will, all my desperate hope, on the blank page. I would write a new future, happy future. A future where Thomas Hayes, the archivist, escaped the subbasement, found peace, and lived a long, fulfilling life. My hand moved slowly at first, then with a strange, almost automatic fluidity. The words flowed from the pen, not in my usual careful block letters, but in a script that was a haunting echo of the Scribe's elegant hand, yet undeniably my own. It was a hybrid, a fusion of two distinct styles, a testament to the merging of my consciousness with the archive's will. I wrote about my resignation, effective immediately. I detailed a new life for myself, far away from the hospital, far from the suffocating silence of the sub-basement. I described a small cottage by the sea, the scent of salt air replacing the antiseptic and dust. I wrote of hobbies I had always dreamed of pursuing, painting seascapes, tending a small garden, reading novels in the sunlight. I wrote of finding companionship, of laughter and warmth, of a peaceful, solitary existence, free from the burdens of forgotten lives and rewritten destinies. I wrote a happy, simple life for myself, a deliberate counter-narrative to the grim prophecy of my fall. I described my health as robust, my mind clear, my spirit at peace. I meticulously detailed my departure from St. Michael's, the handing over of my keys, the final, liberating walk out of the sub-basement, never to return. I wrote about becoming a man who is no longer defined by the archive, but by the quiet joys of a life unburdened. As I wrote, the cold intensified around me, but it was no longer terrifying. It felt like a profound, ancient presence, a silent observer watching my desperate act of defiance. The phantom scratching in my mind softened, becoming a gentle, almost encouraging murmur. As if the Scribe was acknowledging my attempt, perhaps even approving of my desire for a better ending. I finished the entry, my hand aching, my mind exhausted but strangely exhilarated. I had written my own errata, a hopeful correction to a tragic prophecy. I had defied the Scribe, or so I desperately hoped. I clipped the new page to my file, placing it carefully on top of the ominous death certificate, a layer of defiant hope over inevitable doom. I closed the folder, the thin manila cover, now feeling impossibly heavy, pregnant with two conflicting realities. I stood up from my desk, my body feeling strangely light, almost ethereal. The sub-basement, once a place of suffocating dread, now seemed to shimmer with a faint internal light, a subtle luminescence that hinted at the profound unseen forces at play. I turned to leave, a fragile sense of triumph swelling within me. I had rewritten my story. I had chosen life. I had defied fate. But as I took my first step towards the exit, a sudden, sharp gust of cold air, colder than any I had felt before, slammed into my back, pushing me forward. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, plunging the archive into momentary darkness. And when the light returned, my gaze fell upon my desk. A new page, crisp, stark white, lying atop my file. The handwriting was unmistakable, that same elegant, swirling script of the Scribe. It was dated tonight, and the words meticulously inscribed were not a correction, but a chilling response. Patient, Hayes, Thomas, age, 48, admission date, current date, diagnosis, paranoid delusion, severe dissociative episode. Patient exhibits confabulation regarding personal history and future events. Prognosis, guarded, requires immediate psychiatric evaluation and long-term institutionalization. Observations. Patient discovered at 3:17 a.m. in sub-basement archives. Found attempting to alter official records, exhibiting extreme agitation and delusional ideation. Believes he is rewriting fate. Responds to unseen voices. Expresses fear of falling from high places. Notes. Cause of current mental state consistent with prolonged isolation and psychological stress. Previous blank file now contains a detailed, self-written narrative of an impossible future. Disposition. Patient transferred to Psychiatric Ward 7. File remains open for ongoing documentation. Signed, the Scribe. A carefully constructed future, my defiant act of hope, had been twisted, reinterpreted, and meticulously documented as a symptom of my own unraveling sanity. The Scribe had not corrected my death, it had corrected me. My imagined escape, my cottage by the sea, my peaceful life. All of it had been filed away as a delusion. The archive wasn't just rewriting stories, it was rewriting minds. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, was no longer just a potential victim. I was a patient. My life, my purpose, was no longer my own. It was bound to the archive, to the endless task of correcting what was wrong, of remembering what should be. The cold was no longer just external. It was internal, a part of my very essence, a chilling, eternal presence. I was becoming the institutional memory of St. Michael's, a silent, unseen guardian, forever bound to the whispers of the dead. And now, I was also its patient, my descent into madness meticulously documented, one terrifying page at a time. The archive had one. The words on the crisp white page, dated tonight, were a death knell to my desperate defiance. It's a paranoid delusion. Severe dissociative episode. The clinical detachment of the Scribe's elegant script twisted my carefully crafted future into a grotesque mockery of sanity. My imagined escape, my cottage by the sea. The quiet joys of a life unburdened. All of it had been meticulously filed away as a delusion, a symptom of my own unraveling mind. The archive hadn't just rewritten my story, it had rewritten me. The cold that had permeated the sub-basement now intensified, not as a physical chill, but as a profound internal emptiness. It was the cold of absolute despair, the chilling realization that my struggle had been futile, my rebellion, a pre-scripted act in the Scribe's grand design. The phantom scratching, once a symphony of unseen pens, now resonated as a triumphant, mocking chorus within my skull. It was the sound of my defeat, the final meticulous documentation of my descent. Patient discovered at 3:17 a.m. in sub-basement archives. Found attempting to alter official records, exhibiting extreme agitation and delusional ideation. Believes he is rewriting fate, responds to unseen voices. Expresses fear of falling from high places. Every word was a calculated blow, describing my frantic, desperate actions as symptoms of madness. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. I had sought to defy fate, only to have my defiance itself become part of the meticulously documented narrative of my own mental collapse. The fear of falling from high places, a primal terror I had tried to avoid, is now merely another entry in my patient file, a testament to my paranoid delusions. The time, 3:17 a.m., pulsed in my vision. It was the hour of revelations, the moment the veil between realities thinned. But for me, it was no longer the hour of prophecy, but the hour of my capture. The moment my carefully constructed reality would shatter, replaced by the archive's grim truth. A low, insistent hum began to vibrate through the concrete floor, growing steadily louder. It was the sound of the service elevator, the one used by security and maintenance, ascending from the ground level. They were coming for me. The scribe had not only documented my mental state, but had also orchestrated my discovery. My supervisor, Mr. Henderson, would find me not as the diligent archivist, but as the agitated patient, lost in his delusions. I looked at my desk, at the open file, at the pristine white page that sealed my fate. My hand, still clutching the scribe's pen, felt heavy, alien. My fingers, once so adept at organizing and preserving records, an ink-stained, a haunting echo of the shadow version of myself I had seen in the reflection. I was becoming him, not through death, but through madness. The transformation was already underway. The elevator doors hissed open, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the sub-basement. Voices, muffled at first, then growing clearer, carried on the cold air. "Thomas, are you down here, Thomas?" It was Mr. Henderson. His voice laced with concern, but also with a hint of professional detachment. Behind him, I could hear the jingle of keys, the low murmur of other voices. Security, perhaps a psychiatric nurse. They were coming to collect their new patient. I felt a strange, almost serene calm settle over me. The terror remained, a cold, sharp blade in my heart, but it was now intertwined with a dawning, horrifying acceptance. My life, my purpose, was no longer my own. It was bound to the archive, to the endless task of correcting what was wrong, of remembering what should be. The cold was no longer just external, it was internal, a part of my very essence, a chilling, eternal presence. I was becoming the institutional memory of St. Michael's, a silent, unseen guardian, forever bound to the whispers of the dead. Now, I was also its patient. My descent into madness meticulously documented, one terrifying page at a time. The archive had won. As the footsteps grew closer, as the beams of flashlights cut through the gloom, I looked down at the new page in my file. The final entry. It was not a death certificate, but a diagnosis. A sentence. My future, meticulously inscribed by the scribe. I heard Mr. Henderson call my name again, closer now. "Thomas, we're here to help you." Help. The word felt like a cruel joke. There was no help for me. Not anymore. I was already an entry, a patient, a part of the archive's endless narrative. My blank past had been filled, not with the life I had dreamed of, but with the chilling truth of my own unraveling. I closed the file, the thin manila cover now feeling impossibly heavy, pregnant with the weight of my rewritten mind. I stood up from my desk, my body swaying slightly, my gaze fixed on the approaching lights. The sub-basement, once my kingdom, was now my asylum. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, was its newest, most meticulously documented, and utterly lost patient. The archive had one, and I was its final living page. The heavy steel door of Psychiatric Ward 7 clanged shut behind me, the sound echoing with a chilling finality. It wasn't the gentle click of a lock, but the resonant thud of a vault ceiling, trapping me within a new kind of archive. The sub-basement, with its dust and silence, now felt like a distant, almost comforting memory. This new reality was a stark, sterile world of pale green walls, humming fluorescent lights, and the distant, unsettling murmurs of other patients. I was no longer the archivist, the keeper of secrets. I was a patient. My file, meticulously updated by the scribe, had sealed my fate, not with death, but with a diagnosis. Paranoid delusion, severe dissociative episode. The nurses here, kind-faced, but with eyes that held a professional detachment, treated me with a gentle pity. They called me Mr. Hayes. They administered my medications, guided me through group therapy sessions, and listened patiently to my delusions about a sentient archive and a cosmic scribe rewriting destinies. I tried to explain, to articulate the impossible truth of the sub-basement. But my words, once clear and precise, now felt like tangled threads. A chaotic jumble of paranoid ideation. The scribe had not just rewritten my future, it had rewritten my ability to communicate the truth. My days became a monotonous blur. The medication dulled the phantom scratching in my mind, but it never truly silenced it. It became a low, persistent hum, a constant reminder of the archive's unseen presence, of its relentless work. I would sit in the common room staring at the blank television screen. And in the polished surface, I would sometimes catch fleeting glimpses of my older, gaunter self, meticulously writing in the ancient ledger. He was still there, in the sub-basement, fulfilling his role. And I knew with a horrifying certainty that he was writing about me. My file, now residing in the psychiatric ward's digital system, was being updated daily. I knew this because I would sometimes catch a nurse glancing at her tablet, her brow furrowed with concern, before looking at me with that familiar, pitying gaze. The scribe was documenting my descent, my progress through the stages of my illness. Each new entry, each clinical observation, was a testament to the archive's absolute control over my reality. The dreams, which had once been a terrifying gateway to the scribe's dominion, now became a twisted form of therapy. I would dream of the concept files, love, grief, sanity, but they were no longer empty or overflowing. The sanity file, which had crumbled to dust in my earlier dreams, was now a thick, heavy tome, its pages densely packed with frantic, overlapping script. It was my own handwriting, detailing my struggles, my delusions, my slow, agonizing loss of self. The grief file, once a cacophony of anonymous suffering, now contained my name, my face, my personal anguish, meticulously documented. I understood now. The scribe's benevolence was a terrifying trap, corrected what was wrong not to grant true freedom, but to maintain its own intricate order. It gave the dead happy endings within its pages, but it demanded a price from the living. It needed a keeper, a scribe, a consciousness to anchor its vast, impossible memory. And I, Thomas Hayes, had been chosen. Sometimes late at night, when the ward was at its most still, I would hear the whispers. Not the chorus of forgotten voices from the archive, but individual, distinct voices. The child who died of leukemia, thanking me for his rewritten life. The young mother, expressing her joy at her phantom family. The soldier, grateful for his peaceful old age. They were the scribe's creations, the unseen patients, and they were whispering their gratitude to their new keeper. To me, I am Thomas Hayes, and I am a patient in Psychiatric Ward 7, but I am also the scribe. My mind is a porous membrane, absorbing the archive's ancient wisdom, its profound sorrow, its relentless purpose. The cold is no longer just external. It is internal, a part of my very essence, a chilling, eternal presence. I am the institutional memory of St. Michael's, a silent, unseen guardian, forever bound to the whispers of the dead. And every day a new page is added to my file, meticulously documenting my descent into madness, my transformation into the very entity that tormented me. The archive had won, and I was its final living page. My story, once unwritten, was now being meticulously documented, not by me, but through me. The unending cycle had truly begun. And I, Thomas Hayes, the archivist, the patient, the scribe, was finally complete.